This is going to be the story of my father's life and times, Edward VIII of Britain, the father I never knew till now. This ghost-written biography was first contact I had with my father's life when I was 60 years of age. Having been adopted out as an infant into a different class of people, it took a long time to find my way back. Our history begins with the Stone of Scone and the 10 tribes of Israel that left Jerusalem in 586 BC. Let's review our Bible history. You know, Abraham was promised a seed that would bless the entire world, and his bloodline through Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and through the house of Israel arrived in Ireland in 583 BC through the prophet Jeremiah and King Zephaniah's 2 daughters, Sophia and Teotephi. And they began the history of Britain as we are learning it today. Today, the monarchy is still part of that seed of Abraham. The headquarters for the original temple was in Edinburgh, Scotland, when Edward I, the Confessor, took the Stone of Scone and brought it down to London, and he himself was crowned sitting on the stone and accepting a certain kind of structure for his monarchy, in which he held one office, the highest in the hierarchy, and there were lots of other people responsible for getting things done for him. Whereas the king is the head of the church does not appear in the civil hierarchy. That means that outside philosophical orders can begin to infiltrate and dominate what's going on in the monarchy itself. And this is what happened in the British monarchy when the Grand Commander Pike directed a single order be placed above all the other orders. Pike designed a plan for world conquest and wrote of it in a letter dated 1871, and he predicted that there would be 3 world wars that would bring on the onset of a worldwide order. One of these chivalric organizations was the Order of the Bath, and Kaiser Wilhelm was inviting his cousins Tsar Nicholas, Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, and the Duke of York, and Alfred de Rothschild to an Order of the Bath initiation on solstice 1888. And what happened at that solstice changed the world forever. In 1891, 3 Englishmen, including Lord Milner, engaged the goal to organize a secret society, the first deep state, that would unite their world in a federal structure around Britain. They felt this goal could best be achieved by secrecy, a band of men united more to one another than either to principle or to the current situation or system. They felt that the band should pursue its goal by secret political and economic influence behind the scenes, rather than following the traditional structure and functions of the monarchy as the monarchy existed in that day. This provided a problem for us even now. So the background of the 1890s and the Boer War was one of essential treachery. And then in 1892, Prince Albert Victor, the presumed heir of King Edward VII, suddenly disappeared from the scene. It was said that he died, but then it was also said that he was at Glamis Castle. What were we to believe? And what was there about life in the royal family that made parents dress up their little boys as girls? We see this occur in picture after picture. Not only did that happen to Prince Edward VIII, but it also happened to Prince John later on. And it became a source of real embarrassment to the Prince of Wales when he had his investiture. None of the text explains why Georgie, Duke of York, stares into the camera in such a vacant space, or why it is that Edward failed to thrive, and why it was that Albert had such a profound stutter. What was the trauma-based mind control that Albert Victor and Georgie, Duke of York, learned when they were in the British Navy? One small part was learning how to give discipline without leaving any marks or scars. The next topic that didn't come up was the apparent values conflict between Edward and his father. His father was a cult, part of the Masonic orders and chivalric orders of the Garter, the Thistle, and Order of St. John. But Edward's teachers were not. They were Hansel and Finch, very egalitarian Christians who taught Edward the principles of fairness and decency, so that he would always reject the treacherous or the subtleties. In the autobiography, nothing is ever said about the relationship between Hansel and Finch versus the King George V himself. Here, Edward was growing up and starting to be a very capable human being, and he was feeling humiliated because of the design of the investiture suit that his mother had insisted upon. And because he was being asked to dress in a sissified suit, he felt he was being punished, which in essence he sort of was, because his parents by then probably figured out that as a confirmed Christian, he was not going to adopt the occult and elitist viewpoint. And that means that the king and queen were faced with a presumed heir that wasn't going to just automatically follow the top-down Luciferian dogma. So it began to look as if Edward and his parents were at loggerheads, and that there really wasn't a simple solution to this problem. The egoic displays of George V and his wife, the Queen Mary, were manifest, and they were elaborate, and they were enormous, particularly after the coronation in London. A huge retinue was sent out to India to have a second coronation as Emperor of India in 1911. This was not the sort of elaborateness that Edward wanted to experience. Edward was a one-to-one people person. He wasn't a trophy or someone who enjoyed being put on display as an object to be viewed. And he sought his own private time, and he started smoking at a very young age, although in this picture he's 19 years old already. This is 1913. In this 1912 picture, George V looks very pompous, but based on some of this data I see, he got knocked down. and he had to eat some crow. Because in 1902, Alfred de Rothschild reminded him of what had happened back at the bathhouse that Kaiser Wilhelm had invited him to, reminded him of the outcome of the initiation into the Order of the Bath, and reminded him that he had an illegitimate son living in the Rothschild Schicklgruber house, a son who looked so much like the rest of the family that nobody could claim that he was a Rothschild. You see, the Rothschilds and the Schicklgrubers have a very square skull. But this man, whose name is Adolf Schicklgruber, a la Adolf Hitler, has a face shape just like the royal family. Imagine that. You see, King George V and Kaiser Wilhelm were cousins, and so the Kaiser could look after George's illegitimate son and keep tabs on him. And others, too, served as intermediary between King George V and his son in Bavaria. But there are other segments of the family that were of interest. Here in 1909, before George V was actually crowned, here he's seated with Tsar Nicholas's family. And in that family, there's a very interesting person by the name of Elizabeth Fyodorovna, beautiful girl born in 1879, who was the Grand Duchess until her husband was assassinated in 1905. And then she became the prioress of a convent and served the poor. I just think she is just a dynamite human being. Well, yes, she has been sainted by the Russian Orthodox Church. Okay, so here in around 1912, 1913, George V had lots of royal relatives to deal with, and there were lots of monarchies in Europe at the time. But remember, the Masonic directive was all about taking down monarchies and replacing them with a worldwide single dictatorship. And how were they going to do that? Well, the first thing that George did was follow the Rothschild implied directive. You see, now that Rothschild was blackmailing King George V, he could insist that George do some things for him. And the first thing to do, of course, was to set up a worldwide banking network, which in the United States became the Fed. But of course, the City of London has a Rothschild central bank as well. And once the bankers who objected were out of the way, who were lost on the Titanic, then the Fed could be put into place in the United States that cooperated with the British City of London and created a worldwide banking system that was almost impossible to resist. How convenient for starting a war. Okay, so now we're at World War I, and here is Edward VIII, who is the Prince of Wales. He's about 5'5" and weighs about 110 pounds. And what does he do? He runs off to the Grenadier Troop Guards, and he becomes a foot soldier for the next 3.5 years. All I can say about that is he really wanted to have to get away from the palace. Awful bad to do that at his size, because he was in no way, he'd never been to boot camp. He was in no way any shape to be a serious kind of a soldier. Well, so there must have been some reason why he was away from the palace for that length of time, 3.5 years, the duration of the whole war. My goodness, what could have been going on? Well, what we see is Edward, having left to join the Grenadier Troop Guards, now King George got busy, and he established empire world order policies and procedures, means and ends with which Edward would have to contend when he came home. Next thing that George did was help set up the foundling Zionist nation of Israel for a future time, so that the Rothschilds' banking cabal could become international. He did this, of course, for Alfred de Rothschild. And in the meantime, his cousin Nicky in Russia, confronted with centralized banking, said, no, I'm not having centralized banking. Tsar Nicholas was known as an honest man, and he converted from the Rothschild central banks to a national currency, whereby the Rothschilds swore to see him removed as the leader of Russia. So George V was best buddies with his cousin Tsar Nicholas one minute, but when the Rothschilds demanded that the Rothschilds' banks be allowed into Russia and told George he had to get rid of Nicky, guess what he did? Yes, he did. Next, there was the matter of the name Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, because the British people were known to be German, and King George was thrashing about for a substitute name so he wouldn't sound so German. It was Lord Fordham who helped him find the name Windsor, so that the British people didn't live under such. I've been speaking of George's misbehavior, but now Edward got into a liaison with a French dressmaker and sired a son by the name of Pierre. Experiences around the world. After World War I, Edward, Prince of Wales, became a worldwide celebrity. He was on board ship doing a worldwide tour to Canada and Australia and New Zealand and the Far East. And wherever he went, he felt compelled and easy with just being with the people and dressing up the way they dress, or putting on a costume, or taking the side of the ordinary man. And everybody thought he was just wonderful. He was the wonder boy of his generation. In the Orient, he went fishing with the Japanese Emperor Hirohito, and that just seemed like a perfectly normal, natural thing for him to do. But what was his dad doing back in London while he was traveling the world? What we find out from history is that his dad was founding and funding Tavistock to create propaganda in order to promote his new world order. They were setting up the Hegelian dialectic, the worldview schism between random evolution and spiritual or religious determinism. And that way they keep the pot boiling, and they get conflicts going between different populations, because that's what benefits the revolutionary movement, right? Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, daughter of Claude, Earl of Strathmore and Kinghorn, claimed her prize, the Prince of Wales. But he balked and deferred, and she was of the old school, imperialistic and royal, and so they never got along from then on. Now let's talk a little bit about arranged marriages. Let's go into the history a little bit. As you know, Queen Victoria's husband, Albert, was arranged for her. And Edward VII's wife, Alexandra, Queen Alexandra, was from Denmark, and she had to put up with the fact that King Edward VII was a womanizer. Now, between Albert Victor and Georgie, Duke of York, they were dealing with Maytech. And Maytech was set up for Albert Victor, but he didn't like her. So he got together with Elizabeth, a Catholic girl, and married her in secret, and they had a little daughter, Alice, until the royal family broke that up, and Albert Victor ended up at Glamis Castle, which is why the promise was made to the the Lord of Glamis Castle that their daughter would come to the royal house and marry the most eligible of the king's sons. Okay. Well, Edward didn't like her, and I don't think she liked, well, she liked him, but he didn't like her. All right. And so that's why George V said to Edward, if you don't accept an arranged marriage, I will never consent to your marrying. And that's why Edward was not able to marry until his father had died. That's arranged marriage for you. Okay, now let's talk about the British King's actions that were progressing the Rhodes Round Table agenda and the Rothschilds' takeover of Western banking with the establishment of the U.S. Federal Reserve after the sinking of the Titanic. Now, this step created funny money to be used in Masonic wars. Added to this, the founding and funding of Tavistock, the gifting of Palestine to the Rothschilds via the Balfour Declaration, and the adoption of the Kalergi Plan to alter the cultural makeup of Europe. None of these actions occurred in concert with the Church of England, with which Edward VII and George V both headed, and which Edward was a member of. So everything that George V was doing while Edward was away at war and away on worldwide trips was anathema to Edward, because it was compromising and turning off his own personal reign. At this point, we've only got to 1923, because the Kalergi Plan was promoted beginning in 1921. And so when Edward was on one of his trips to Canada, he bought a large spread, Pekisco in Alberta, to serve as his own dude ranch, to serve as his own place to ride horses on the range and to get along with the guys, because he always got along with the guys, whether they were in the military or wherever they were. He was a regular guy, and he liked regular guy things. And so the Pekisco Ranch was supposedly going to be exploited for oil. His father, George V, in 1930, gave him a contract for oil development that would generate the cash flow necessary to keep up the property. However, that oil contract was abrogated and never put into effect. But in the meantime, Edward ran his cross-country races with a few injuries, and he intervened in the coal strike, which his royal family didn't like at all because he wasn't on the side of the coal companies. And he made enough noise and got enough attention that he became Time Magazine's Man of the Year in 1929. He was considered the darling of the jet set in those days. And mostly you would find him at the West End celebrating and being with the people, because that's what gave him pleasure, since he could not marry. He had lady friends on the side, most of them married, but mostly he was required to be alone. And on Sundays, like the dutiful son, he would have to get in the carriage, horse carriage in the 30s, and go to church with his parents, which was just really sad to see a guy who's 36 years old having to dutifully, like a wimp, go to church with his parents. Yikes. But then something changed. In 1931, he met an interesting lady. Wallis Warfield Simpson was part of the circle of friends of Lady Furness, who was Edward's companion in those days. And Wallis started attending Lady Furness's parties, and Edward was at those parties, and they started a friendship and association that grew into a lot more than that. As you can see from her pictures, Wallis was very pretty, and she had a narrow nose and a rounded chin. She wore her hair parted in the center, and it was always very long. So Edward and Wallis Warfield Simpson were an item, and much to George V's delight, because Wallis had been an MI5 agent acting as an intermediary between the king and Adolf Schicklgruber, whose name was changed to Hitler in 1902, back from 1917 to 1921, when she was married to Spencer. And so the king thought he had Edward completely tricked and flummoxed. Wallis had a daughter in 1934 that they named Elizabeth, but she was kidnapped and disappeared into America, into Tennessee eventually, and that daughter's website is we3.org, and she grew up as Elizabeth. My kids look a lot like her kids. Her we3.org website is not active now, but she tells the whole story of her abduction and the alteration of her birth certificate, if you can imagine. Okay, so the treachery that was going on in the family continued, and Edward became very suspicious around 1932, like, wait a minute, why am I being put in this box and not allowed to exert my own will? His father, George V, was still friendly with Kaiser Wilhelm, and the Templar order had a lot to do with the beginnings of the next war, since it responded to Albert Pike's directives. Now, Edward continued to be a socialite in the London scene, but in 1934 he realized that he couldn't continue with Wallis. He found a substitute Wallis by the name of Claudia Ruth O'Keeffe, sister of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. Here you can see the difference between the two women. So when Claudia took over, notice that her nose is broader and her chin comes to more of a point. This is Claudia with Edward's doppelganger. Okay, and yes, in those days, the royals also used doppelgangers, as you will see, that they have used all along. So there were doppelgangers in use who claimed to be Edward and that claimed to be Wallis, and they were not real, just as doppelgangers today claim or appear to be the royals in the activity. See, here you can see Wallis had a very broad nose and a sharp chin. You see how She's not the same. This is the Wallis that's Claudia, but they continued in the press to claim that this was Wallis Warfield Simpson. And it wasn't Wallis Warfield Simpson. It was Claudia Ruth O'Keeffe. And she and Edward did the social rounds in the Bahamas and in Paris. And everybody thought that Wallis Simpson was the one that married Edward. You see here in 1935 at the Silver Jubilee of King George V, the look on Edward's face is very, very dubious, like, what is going on here? He realized that there was a group of men in the background who were deciding, because he would not support the actions of the king in the terms of the Balfour Declaration and the Tavistock Institution and the funny money for wars and the Kalergi plan, he was not, they courtiers felt that he was not cut out to be king because he didn't want the one world order the way his brother was willing as a Mason to bring the Council on Foreign Relations to bear fruit in the world. Edward was against it. In this, some of the wedding photos of Edward and Claudia, Wallis is in pink and tan and Claudia is in blue. You can see the difference very, very clearly. So by the time of the abdication of Edward in December 1936, he was with Claudia Ruth O'Keeffe and not with Wallis. And they lived together for the next 35 years. And Edward was never a Templar. He never followed the Masonic dictates to create 3 world wars, and he was not willing to do that. And here's the very strange picture of his father's funeral with the German army at the foot of the bier and the British army at the side and the family not present at all. And so as popular and as personable and as egalitarian and populist and nationalist as Edward was, the ruling powers of the day would not allow him to be king in any way, shape, or form. And they saw to it, in addition, that his children, and he had 5 children. We will never see Pierre. He was born in 1918, and he died an old man. But Elizabeth's pictures are up on We3, and so that's where we are. So what happened was, in 1937, the regular monarchy principles were thrown out the window, and a new set of principles, a deep state, was established to bring about a change in the demographics of Europe and a solidification and centralization of banking worldwide, and a property grab and land grab to give only the effete elites all the power and leave the people out of governance entirely. Essentially, the Marxist revolution had come to the upper classes of the banksters and the intelligentsia, and as Saul Alinsky so aptly stated, True revolutionaries do not flaunt their radicalism. They cut their hair, put on suits, and infiltrate the system from within. And that's exactly what the Council on Foreign Relations, the deep state, did in 1937 when George VI was crowned. The press, ever since then, has been telling the story of Wallis, although it was Claudia who married Edward. They're telling the story that Edward never had any children, although he fathered 5 kids from 1918 to 1944. The press says that the reason Edward abdicated, not that he was deposed, was having to do with the marriage. But the truth of the matter was that Edward was brought up to be a Christian and hold to the kingdom covenant of the Stone of Scone, and he was unwilling to stage World War II and to go on with the deep state agenda to change the monarchy from a covenant into a radical socialist top-down dictatorship. He wasn't buying in, but the press has never relented to this day. And that's what I noticed when I started reading biographies, that the biographies all tell the same story. The magazines all tell the same story. And they all leave out the cogent and important details about how Edward felt about what was happening to him and how he felt about what his father was doing behind his back when he was in the service in World War I, and how he felt about what happened to his uncle Albert Victor and Prince John and Tsar Nicholas, and then his own daughter in 1934 was taken. So when he went to Germany, where he met Hitler, who was actually his half-brother, I don't know whether Hitler remarked that this was not the same Wallis that he knew from 1921. This is a recent picture of Margaret Anne Windsor, Edward's daughter, born in 1939, kidnapped and taken to the American South in Georgia in 1941. Okay? And so World War II came upon the world, as was predicted and directed by Albert Pike. And at the tail end of World War II, I came along in 1944, and as my 2 sisters were abducted and given falsified birth certificates, the same thing happened to me in 1944. And so the only way I can trace and track my lineage now is with DNA testing, which is now proceeding. I got to have my whole family tested and tracked. In the meantime, after the war, Elizabeth, who was introduced and initiated into the occult way of thinking also, she became queen, and Edward retired to nice places in France, and where he was until his death in 1972. He died, he's buried at Frogmore, and Margaret insists that that's the doppelganger that's buried at Frogmore. He's buried in Alabama. Look, I don't know who is buried. But on EdwardVIII's peerage.com resume, you can see what he stood for, and it wasn't a cult, and it wasn't the Council on Foreign Relations. And in 1972, guess who shows up in London for the funeral? Isn't that amazing? His half-brother. And so apparently Elizabeth knew about Adolf's relationship to the family. Again, we have to think about our ends and our means, and if our means are cruel and difficult and hard, then what we get is not a goal that we hoped for, but we get what's cruel and mean and hard. And so the Council on Foreign Relations agenda has continued with centralized banking, Agenda 21, and governance by deceit. The United Nations has become the object of veneration by third world political corrupted parties, but the principles of the monarchy have been, I don't know if you could say they've been overwritten, because God established the monarchy with the Stone of Scone and the patriarch Jacob. Now, if the United Kingdom has become a corporation and the members of parliament are a corporation and the Labour Party is a corporation, does that affect the covenant? I suspect not. I suspect the covenant is still there. And in the eyes of God, the kingdom is still there, if only it is to be exercised. The use of treachery to dominate and control has not abated. The use of doppelgangers, rationalized as they were on the official Buckingham Palace website back in 2007, continues. Doppelgangers continue, and I have pages and pages and pages of false identities claiming to be this royal or that royal or another royal in this or that royal event. At a recent opening of Parliament, you can see very well this is not Queen Elizabeth II, okay? So the monarchy has been busy dishonoring itself with treachery and kidnapping and disappearing people, and that's their modus operandi, because they support the deep state Council on Foreign Relations and its globalist, Zionist, Islamist, fascist regime. Now, I've told part of the story in my book about my father, and so that book is under revision now, because I found out so much more information recently. I have enough pictures of my father to realize that even though the DNA test results aren't back yet, but I certainly resemble him a great deal, and my son Scott resembled him at the age of 22, and my son Andrew sure is a dead ringer for George V. Isn't that amazing? How close Andrew is to George V. And this is my daughter Heather, and my eldest, and she is surprisingly a lookalike for Claudia Ruth O'Keeffe, and even her daughter Margaret, and that's a YouTube picture of her daughter. And this is my youngest son, and along with the picture of Sergei, the youngest son of Tsar Nicholas. And so I come to the end of this historiography now. So here we are 80 years after the abdication of Edward, and the treachery of the deep state is continuing to not only affect us, but be discovered every day in the Pizzagate and pedophile scandals, and in the senseless wars of attrition that don't get won, they just slaughter people, and in the senseless privatization of public utilities and public services, and in the massive immigration hordes that are disrupting the civil societies of the West. The civil societies of the West have also been disrupted by cultural Marxism, in which the family and the neighborhood and the state and the country and the culture and the society are treated with such disdain and disgust by the, quote, progressive element, the liberals, who feel that license and permission to be stupid and permission to be silly and irreverent and disrespectful somehow expresses their intelligence. I'm sorry, I don't get that. And so you see the underlying thread of treachery and the practice of disappearing members of the family that don't align with the CFR, which the royals of Britain particularly has pursued. And that's how it has been for the past more than 80 years. Actually, it began in 1892 with the disappearance of Albert Victor. And so all I can say to Queen Elizabeth, if she's still alive, because I don't know, there's so many doppelgangers showing up, I never know when it's her. If the royals think that this is what monarchy was supposed to be about, they and God need to have a talk, because what they're doing has not amounted to governance by consent of the people to the laws, and it has not resulted in clarifying jurisdictions, where what is the jurisdiction of commerce, what is the jurisdiction of personal relationship, what is the jurisdiction of the geographical state, what is the jurisdiction of the planet. The laws have not been examined with a view to helping clarity, coherence, and justice. So this has been Emily Windsor Craig, the youngest daughter of Edward VIII. And now you've seen the rest of the story. Bye.